Before the age of thermostats and silent vents, nightfall arrived with a weight that could be felt in the bones. When the last traces of sunlight slipped behind distant hills, a different world awakened, one where cold was not an inconvenience, but a patient adversary. In small homes scattered across Europe, Asia, and the early frontiers of America, families felt the first breath of darkness seep through timber seams, carrying with it the promise of a long and unforgiving night. Frost crept over windows like a living script, whispering warnings across thin panes, while breath rose in pale clouds even indoors. People understood the rhythm of winter in a way we no longer do. They sensed the shift in the air before any storm appeared. They noticed how silence thickened before temperatures plunged, and how animals moved differently when bitter winds approached. The cold had patterns, moods, and secrets, and survival depended on reading them with quiet precision. Warmth was never taken for granted. It was earned through discipline, preparation, and an awareness sharpened by necessity. Families gathered close around small flames, not for comfort alone, but to guard against a creeping chill that could slip in unnoticed. They layered their homes with whatever insulation the land offered, wool, bark, moss, or mud. Yet even then, winter often pushed through. Nights stretched longer than they do in most places today, and the darkness felt deeper, as if the sky pressed itself against the earth. Every creak of settling wood, every sudden gust at the door, carried meaning. Children were taught to listen, not out of fear, but because listening kept them alive. And within this fragile world, people held knowledge that now feels almost mythical. They knew how to trap heat in stone and carry embers between dwellings. They understood which foods warmed the body from within, and how to breathe slowly to keep muscles from tightening in the cold. These weren't tricks or curiosities, they were essential skills woven into daily life, passed down like sacred inheritance. We walk through winter now with lights, heaters, and conveniences that mute the old dangers. Yet something in us still responds to the memory of those nights, a faint instinct stirring beneath modern comforts, reminding us that there was a time when darkness was a threat and warmth a triumph. And so the question rises quietly, what did they understand that we have allowed to fade? Long before modern clocks told us when a day should begin or end, people lived by a rhythm shaped not by schedules, but by a sky that behaved in ways we would struggle to recognize. There were winters when darkness arrived earlier than expected, resting on the land like a heavy blanket that refused to lift. Farmers rose before dawn, only to find the horizon still swallowed by night, the fields coated in frost that animals sensed before humans ever did. Creatures moved differently in these seasons, shifting their routines as if obeying an unseen signal that whispered of deeper cold on the way. Monks in remote stone monasteries recorded nights that lasted longer than any they had known, writing by dim candlelight as they listened to wind dragging across frozen towers. Travelers spoke of journeys taken beneath stars that seemed unwilling to fade, telling stories of mornings that never quite became bright. These accounts might sound exaggerated to us, shaped by memory or fear, yet patterns appear across cultures separated by vast distances. Some historians dismiss these writings as poetic imagination, but others wonder if these people were witnessing natural cycles we no longer experience. Our planet has shifted over millennia, tilting, wobbling, and settling into different positions that changed the way sunlight touched the Earth. If nights once stretched farther than they do now, it would explain why early societies prepared for winters with such meticulous care. It might also reveal why their homes, their clothing, even their daily routines were built around endurance rather than convenience. Perhaps our calendar, defined by fixed dates and predictable seasons, hides older rhythms that ancient people could feel without instruments or maps. They lived in direct conversation with the land, noticing subtle signals that modern life has muted. Their stories of long nights may be fragments of memory from a world operating on a timetable we have forgotten. And if their nights truly lasted longer, then everything that followed their heating methods, their survival strategies, their understanding of winter, begins to make far more sense, guiding us toward the techniques they developed to endure a darkness we can barely imagine. As we step into their world, we begin to see why their ingenuity mattered, and how their quiet methods for holding warmth shaped the nights that followed then. People today imagine winter nights lit by a single glowing hearth, as if one flame could hold back the cold. But for families who lived in older worlds, a fire was only the beginning. An open flame warmed whoever sat closest, while the rest of the house remained trapped in a breathless chill. Heat escaped quickly through gaps in timber, vanishing into the dark before it could settle. Those who depended on a simple blaze soon learned that fire alone could not stand against the long cold. They needed methods shaped by patience, memory, and an understanding of warmth that feels foreign to us now. Embers were buried deep in ash to hold their glow until morning, turning a simple fire into a quiet reservoir of heat. Clay pots were placed near the flame, absorbing warmth slowly and releasing it through the night like sleeping guardians. Stone beds, heated long before nightfall, radiated a steady comfort that open flames could never provide. Families studied the way air moved through their homes, blocking some pathways and opening others, guiding warmth as carefully as water in a handmade channel. These small decisions, repeated every evening, kept winter from creeping too far inside. Such techniques rarely appear in history books. They were considered ordinary, too humble to document, or brushed aside as countryside habits with no grand story behind them. Yet these ignored practices saved lives. They reveal how deeply people understood their surroundings, how closely they watched the behavior of smoke, sparks, and shifting drafts. The cold taught them a language we no longer speak, one shaped by instinct rather than instruction. What survives of that knowledge now feels like scattered clues left behind by a vanished world. When we look at these old methods, we see a different kind of intelligence, quiet, subtle, and almost invisible, unless you know where to look. It hints that warmth was never a single act, but a layered system built through generations of trial and error. And as these methods come into view, they open a doorway to something larger, because keeping warm was not only about tools or materials. It was about the entire household moving in harmony against the night, preparing together for the hours when darkness pressed closest. From here, the story begins to widen, revealing how every part of a home and every person within it played a role in surviving the cold. Long before insulation came in, rolls and walls were filled with manufactured foam. Families built their homes as if they were living creatures designed to hold heat close. In a small medieval settlement, as the last leaves began to fall, one family prepared their dwelling for the winter ahead. Their home was modest, but every beam and stone carried a quiet intention. The roof was layered with turf taken from nearby fields, heavy and damp, yet remarkably effective at trapping warmth beneath its weight. Snow would settle on it later, forming another insulating blanket, turning the house into a silent shelter against the freezing months. The walls were made of timber, set in pairs, the gap between them filled with packed moss gathered during the warmer seasons. This natural layer breathed gently, holding warmth while preventing moisture from creeping inside. Beneath the floor, earth had been shaped and hardened into a thick platform that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. In the corner of the home, a low entrance led to a partially underground room, its temperature steady year-round. Families retreated there on the harshest nights, surrounding themselves with warmth stored directly from the soil. These designs seem simple at first glance, perhaps even crude, yet when viewed through the lens of experience, they reveal something surprising. Many of these old features outperformed modern homes in ways we rarely acknowledge. A turf roof stayed warm even when winds cut across empty fields. Moss walls resisted drafts better than some contemporary builds. Earthen floors provided a gentle, radiant heat that required no machinery, no fuel, only patience and familiarity with the land. It raises an unsettling question. How did ordinary builders, with no formal training, understand the laws of warmth so naturally? Their knowledge came from long observation, trial passed through generations, and a closeness to the environment modern life has mostly erased. They recognized where cold gathered, how wind curled around corners, and which materials invited warmth to linger. As winter approached, preparation was not a task, but a ritual. Each repair, each patch of moss pressed into place, felt like securing another layer of protection. And once the home was ready, the family turned to the next challenge, surviving the long nights inside it, where warmth depended not only on the structure itself, but on the way every inhabitant moved, rested, and worked together against the dark. In the deep cold of earlier centuries, sleep was not a single stretch of silence, but a series of careful intervals shaped by necessity. Families rarely surrendered to the night all at once. Instead, they slipped into segmented rest, waking and sleeping in turns, as if the household itself breathed in slow cycles. Long before the world spoke of insomnia or sleep science, people understood that uninterrupted sleep could be dangerous. A fire left untended might wither into lifeless ash. A draft slipping through an unnoticed crack might freeze water in a bucket before dawn, and so someone always remained awake. These watchers moved quietly through the home, checking the glow of embers, adjusting shutters, listening for the unsettling stillness that signaled a sudden drop in temperature. They knew the voices of the night, creaking beams, shifting snow, restless animals. Their vigilance protected not only their own families but often the homes nearby, for a fading fire in one dwelling could spread cold through a cluster of houses connected by shared walls. In this way, the night became a collective responsibility, a woven fabric of trust and routine. Communities even synchronized their waking hours. One household might rise shortly after midnight, another toward the darkest point of the night, and another just before dawn. The pattern created an unseen network of guardianship, stretching across a village. A person awake in one home provided comfort to those resting in the next, knowing that when their own eyes finally closed, someone else would take up the quiet watch. It was an unspoken rhythm passed from generation to generation, so familiar that few questioned it. Travelers who passed through these regions often found the pattern strange. They wrote of lights flickering in windows when the world should have been completely still, and of villagers who rose with calm purpose at what outsiders considered unnatural hours. Yet for those who lived there, this broken sleep carried a certain reassurance. It allowed families to face the darkness in manageable pieces, never fully giving themselves to it and never standing alone against it. As winter deepened and nights grew longer, this choreography of wakefulness became a form of protection as important as any tool or shelter. And within those hours, when one person watched while another slept, subtle practices emerged, methods to stay warm, to stay alert, and to stay alive. These personal strategies reveal another layer of winter survival, found not in walls or fire, but in the things people carried and wore against the cold. In the frozen months of earlier centuries, clothing was not chosen for appearance. It was built, layer by deliberate layer, as if each garment formed a barrier between the body and the waiting cold. Heavy wool, thick with natural lanolin, wrapped around shoulders like a second skin. It held warmth, even when snow gathered on its surface, and the scent of sheep and smoke lingered in its fibers, reminding its wearer of summer fields now hidden beneath ice. Beneath that, wool came inner wraps of softer fabric, woven tightly so that heat had nowhere to escape. The cold pressed against these layers, but rarely broke through. Furs were laid across backs and chests, stitched into cloaks that rustled softly when moved. The fur trapped heat with an efficiency modern materials sometimes struggle to match. Villagers rubbed herbal oils into leather leggings and sleeves, the oils stiffening slightly in the cold, yet forming a shield that kept moisture at bay. Leg wrappings were bound with practiced hands, crisscrossing from ankle to knee, sealing the limbs so the blood stayed warm and steady. Each layer had its place, and missing one could mean the difference between comfort and danger. These garments aged with their owners. They crackled when lifted from hooks above the hearth, where smoke dried them slowly after each winter day. The fire left its faint scent upon them, mixing with oils, resin, and the earthy notes of wool. When worn together, these items created a cocoon of warmth, not luxurious but deeply dependable. A person stepping into them felt prepared, as though they were donning armor crafted by the land itself. Yet some choices carried meaning beyond practicality. Certain animal furs were believed to hold protective qualities, not just warmth. A layer of wolf fur over the shoulders symbolized strength. A strip of fox across the chest signified cleverness and agility. Even the herbs mixed into oils sometimes followed old traditions, chosen as much for their symbolic power as their physical effect. We're told now that these ideas were superstition, but the people who lived by them seemed to understand something we lost, how belief itself could steady the mind against the cold. Their clothing was more than material. It was memory, instinct, and quiet knowledge stitched together. As families stepped into these layers, they prepared not only their bodies but their spirits for the long season ahead. And just as garments protected them from the cold outside, the foods they prepared protected them from the cold within. When the last warmth of autumn faded, food became more than nourishment. It became strategy. Families who understood the cold knew that every bite carried weight, shaping how the body responded to the long nights ahead. As the final harvest approached, entire communities moved with practiced precision. Grain was stripped from stalks and spread in thin lines to dry beside fading sunlight. Root vegetables were cleaned, sorted, and lowered into deep pits lined with straw, where the earth itself guarded them from frost. Meat was cut carefully along natural seams, each piece destined for a different method of preservation. Nothing was hurried, because each choice affected survival. Winter diets were designed to burn slowly within the body. Heavy stews simmered for hours, thick with barley, marrow bones, and herbs that warmed from the inside out. Old families believed certain foods carried a kind of heat that didn't rise suddenly, but settled deep, drifting through the bloodstream like embers beneath ash. Broths were infused with herbs chosen not for flavor, but for subtle effects on circulation, digestion, and mood. Many of these combinations are forgotten now, dismissed as curiosities, yet the people who relied on them understood their value well enough to stake their lives on them. A warm meal at dusk offered more than comfort. It steadied the body for the hours when darkness pressed hardest. Children were taught which foods to eat before sleep, which to avoid, and which were reserved for the coldest nights when breath hung in the air like smoke. There were even stories linking certain roots to clarity of mind, suggesting that these meals shaped both strength and spirit. What makes this knowledge intriguing is how old it appears to be. Some of these dietary patterns echo practices from far older civilizations, cultures long dissolved into fragments of pottery and myth. It raises the quiet possibility that winter diets carried wisdom older than recorded history, passed through generations not with books, but with shared meals and whispered instruction. In those long winters, food was chosen with intention, its purpose extending far beyond taste. Every ingredient carried a task: warming, calming, fueling, or sustaining. And once these foods were prepared, families turned to the next challenge, ensuring these precious supplies lasted through the depths of the season, protected against time and cold. In the cold months of earlier centuries, survival depended not only on gathering food, but on making it last through a winter that felt endless. Preservation was an art shaped by patience and quiet discipline, carried out in dim corners of homes and barns, where the air itself seemed suspended in stillness. Smokehouses often glowed faintly at the edge of a village, their scent drifting through the night as strips of meat hung above slow-burning embers. The smoke rose gently, curling around each piece in a ritual that took hours, sometimes days, until the flesh hardened into something capable of enduring time. Underground cellars held another world entirely. Families climbed down wooden steps into darkness, their hands brushing the cool stone walls where rows of earthen jars waited. Inside these jars sat vegetables layered in salt brine, grains sealed against rodents, roots packed in straw, and jars of fat congealed into pale, protective shields. The air was cold but strangely comforting, carrying a calm that came from knowing the earth itself was protecting their supplies. Preservation was never a single season's task. It was a continuous rhythm woven into daily life. Herbs were collected at different stages of the year, then hung from loft beams, drying slowly above rising hearth heat. Fermenting crocks needed tending, their lids wiped clean to prevent mold from creeping in. Salt piles were guarded carefully. Families rationed handfuls with almost ceremonial precision, knowing that each pinch was a barrier between nourishment and spoilage. What makes these methods remarkable is not only their ingenuity, but their reliability. Some foods kept for years without losing their strength. Modern techniques, for all their precision, cannot always match the quiet efficiency of a smoke-dried cut of meat or a well-sealed jar nestled in packed earth. It raises the question of how many of these practices were born from observation alone, and how many carried meanings deeper than preservation. Certain smoke rituals, performed at night, were said to ward off unseen dangers. Whether symbolic or practical, they shaped the atmosphere of the work, turning necessity into something almost sacred. Through these techniques, food did more than endure. It transformed, gaining flavors, textures, and energies suited for winter. And once supplies were secured, families turned their attention to another form of preparation, creating the medicines and herbal mixtures that strengthened them from within during the coldest months. Before the first frost settled over the fields, healers walked the edges of the village, gathering the last green remnants of the season. They moved slowly, knowing which plants held warmth even after winter stripped the land bare. Yarrow for fevers, horseroot for strength, elder for the deep coughs that echoed through homes when nights grew too long. These herbs were not rare treasures hidden in distant forests. They grew near doorways, along pathways, beside the same streams children played around in summer. Their power came from familiarity, from generations learning exactly when each root reached its peak and when each leaf carried its greatest potency. As winter tightened its grip, families turned to these simple medicines with quiet confidence. A pot simmering on the hearth filled the room with steam scented faintly of earth and resin. Parents mixed syrups thickened with honey, stirring slowly until the herbs released their strength. Children learned to cut roots into thin slivers, practicing the careful motions taught by elders who remembered harsher winters than any that remained in memory. These infusions warmed the chest, steadied the breath, and reminded the body of the warmth it once knew. Some practices reached further into mystery. On certain nights, bundles of dried herbs were burned beside windows or doorframes. The rising smoke curled into the darkness, believed to push back the cold that pressed relentlessly against the home. Whether this ritual held true medicinal value, or simply gave people a sense of control during the blackest hours, it served its purpose. Fear retreated, if only slightly, and the family felt connected to a lineage that stretched far beyond their own lifetime. These rituals hint at something older than recorded tradition. Similar smoke practices appear across distant regions, in places that shared no trade routes or common language. It leaves open the possibility that winter once demanded responses now forgotten, and that these herbs were chosen not only for physical healing, but for the symbolic strength they carried. When a night grew dangerous, the scent of burning leaves or the taste of a bitter tea reminded villagers they were not helpless. They had tools shaped by time and memory. And as these remedies eased the weight of the cold, they also prepared families for the deeper challenge ahead, surviving winter not alone, but as part of a community bound together by knowledge and need. Through the darkest nights, when winter tightened its hold and nights stretched longer than anyone wished, the village answered with something greater than any individual could offer alone. Families stepped out of their dim homes carrying bowls, jars, and bundles of bread wrapped in cloth, making their way toward the central hall or the largest house in the settlement. What appeared to be a feast was never simply a celebration. It was a calculated act of survival. By coming together, villagers shared warmth, food, and the reassurance that no one faced the cold in isolation. Inside, heavy wooden tables were lined with dishes prepared from the season's preserved stores. Stews thick with root vegetables simmered beside platters of smoked meat. Children craned their necks for glimpses of honeyed grains saved for special nights, while elders watched closely to ensure every household received its share. The warmth rising from so many bodies created a heat no hearth could manage alone, filling the room with a living glow that pushed back the stillness waiting outside. These gatherings carried a psychological weight understood instinctively. Loneliness during winter could weaken even the strongest spirit. A single troubled mind might slip into despair, and despair was as dangerous as frostbite. The feast, with its shared laughter and familiar scents, kept such shadows at bay. Stories passed between families, reminding everyone that they belonged to something larger than their own walls. News travelled quickly in those hours: who needed help, who had extra grain, who had lost livestock to a storm. Information meant survival as much as food did. Yet beneath the warmth and noise, another pattern quietly shaped these nights. Many feasts followed the moon's phases or marked turning points in the season, though few villagers questioned why. These timings had been followed for generations, guided not by written rules but by memory and instinct. Some whispered that the gatherings aligned with ancient customs older than their religion, fragments of a forgotten calendar that once governed entire civilizations. Whether true or not, the timing always felt right, as if the land itself signaled when people should assemble. Outside, torches flickered in the snow, casting long shadows that swayed like silent watchmen. Inside, the hum of voices wrapped the room in a protective veil, a reminder that winter's dangers weakened when people stood together. And when the feast drew to a close, families returned home with fuller hearts, ready to face the cold again, supported not only by food, but by the bonds that held their community together through the darkest nights. When winter settled over a settlement, the village changed shape. Paths that seemed ordinary in summer transformed into channels guiding people between shared resources, each movement echoing through the community like the pulse of a single body. Narrow lanes twisted between houses not by accident, but in a pattern shaped over generations, positioned to shield neighbours from bitter winds sweeping down from open fields. Wells stood at central points where snow was cleared more frequently, allowing water to be drawn even in the coldest weeks. These places were more than structures. They were arteries feeding life into every home. During winter, roles grew sharper and more defined. Elders watched the sky with practiced eyes, reading subtle signs in cloud texture or the silence of birds. Their warnings often came before storms announced themselves. Hunters studied the shifting behavior of animals, understanding when herds would migrate, when predators would appear, and when food would run scarce. Children, though small, became crucial helpers. They gathered firewood, packed snow into protective mounds around home foundations, and carried messages between families. Travelers arriving at the edge of the village were judged quickly. If resources ran thin, kindness had to be measured against survival. The deeper one looks, the clearer the pattern becomes. These villages behaved as unified organisms, each home acting like a cell, each task contributing to the whole. A family struggling with cold or hunger was not left to fend for itself, because one failing part could weaken the entire structure. Cooperation was not a choice, but a necessity, a silent agreement that winter demanded collective strength. Hidden within this unity were architectural strategies seldom mentioned in modern histories. Some villages angled their homes in a formation that redirected harsh winds, creating sheltered pockets where warmth lingered longer. Others built barns in rings, using the heat of animals to warm inner courtyards. These choices appear simple, yet their effectiveness hints at knowledge older than the villages themselves, perhaps inherited from peoples who lived through even harsher winters. Their wisdom carried forward without written record. In this way, the winter village breathed. It protected, adapted, and endured as a single entity, each person contributing to the rhythm that kept cold from claiming too much. And within this living structure, the heart of survival beat strongest in the home itself, where families shaped their own nightly routines to withstand the deepening dark. When the deep cold arrived, a family transformed into something disciplined and finely ordered, as if winter itself rearranged the shape of their lives. Age, strength, and quiet experience decided who did what. The eldest watched the sky with the same focus they once gave their own children, sensing changes long before snow began to fall. They understood how a faint shift in wind or a sudden silence across the fields foretold trouble. Their words carried weight, for winter punished those who ignored subtle warnings. The strongest in the household woke before dawn, stepping into frozen barns to check on animals whose warmth often meant survival. They moved through the cold with steady determination, clearing ice from latches, tightening ropes, and whispering softly to restless creatures. Meanwhile, younger family members busied themselves with quicker tasks done near the hearth, fetching water before it froze, rubbing warmth into cracked hands, and preparing simple meals that fueled everyone for the hours ahead. Nightfall brought its own pattern, a sequence of rituals repeated so often they became second nature. Parents circled the home, pressing their palms to walls to feel for cold seeping through unseen gaps. Children heated stones on the hearth, wrapping them in cloth before sliding them beneath blankets, turning beds into small islands of comfort. Elders murmured, predictions drawn from memory, speaking of nights when the frost behaved strangely or storms arrived without warning. These stories were more than guidance. They were threads binding the generations together. What makes these roles fascinating is how unquestioned they were. Everyone seemed to know their place, as if the hierarchy had been carved into the family's identity long before any of them were born. Some duties, especially the nighttime ones, carried a quiet sense of inheritance. The same person who kept watch in one generation often produced a child who felt the same pull, rising instinctively when the house fell silent. These patterns hint at traditions so old their origins vanished, leaving only the rhythm behind. Within this structure, a family functioned like a small, self-contained world. The cold strengthened their unity, shaping behaviors that made isolation less dangerous. Yet no household stood alone. Even the strongest families reached outward when winter pressed harder, relying on neighbors just as they relied on each other. And so the lines drawn inside one home soon mirrored the wider patterns linking every household across the village. When winter pressed hardest, a single household could not stand alone. The cold moved through villages like a quiet hunter, creeping around corners and slipping through cracks that no one could seal entirely. To survive, neighbors formed bonds as essential as fire itself. Homes were built close together, their walls creating narrow corridors where wind lost its force. Livestock barns stood side by side, their combined heat seeping into the surrounding ground, turning a cluster of structures into a shared refuge against the night. During the deepest cold, families listened not only to the sounds inside their own homes, but to the faint echoes rising from their neighbours. If a fire dimmed unexpectedly, someone nearby would notice the absence of smoke or the sudden stillness where warmth once radiated. Embers were carried across snow in covered pots, their faint glow protected from the wind. A single coal, glowing softly in the dark, could mean the difference between a night endured and a night lost. These exchanges happened without discussion, guided by the understanding that no house should fall completely cold. Cooperation extended into the unforgiving hours when storms erased the world beyond a few steps. In those moments, villagers relied on gestures more than words. A lantern held high meant danger on the road. A quick tap on a shared wall signaled that a family was awake and watching. When snow piled against doors, small patrols moved between homes, clearing paths and checking that livestock still breathed beneath thick blankets of frost. These patrols weren't official duties, they were acts born from memory, shaped by winters that had once claimed too many. What makes these alliances particularly intriguing is how similar patterns appear in distant cultures that never cross paths. From northern Europe to isolated mountain settlements in Asia, communities aligned homes to break the wind, shared embers when fires weakened, and used simple signals to call for help during storms. It suggests a deeper root, an ancient understanding carried across migrations and centuries, as if humanity once learned a single lesson about winter and never truly forgot it. Through these quiet acts, villages became networks of warmth stitched together by instinct and necessity. And as people moved through the dark, helping one another without hesitation, they confronted not only the physical cold, but the emotional weight that winter carried. For the deepest threats of the season were not always found outside the walls, they often lived in the mind. Winter brought a kind of darkness that felt heavier than the simple absence of light. It pressed against windows and seeped through narrow gaps, settling in corners of the home where the fire's glow could not quite reach. To ancient families, this darkness seemed to possess its own quiet intentions. They did not speak of it as a force to be conquered, but as something to be respected, observed, and never underestimated. Long nights bred uneasy dreams, and people often woke with the sense that something had been standing just beyond the edge of sight. Strange sounds deepened this feeling. Wood expanding in the cold cracked like distant footsteps. Wind circling through the lanes moaned against shutters in voices that seemed almost human. Even animals behaved differently. Dogs lifted their heads at invisible disturbances, while livestock shifted restlessly as if sensing what the family could not see. These moments shaped the belief that winter nights were not empty. They were crowded with old memories, with stories passed through generations about wanderers who vanished when they ignored the signs. Yet these fears, rather than paralyzing people, served a purpose. They made night watchers more attentive, listening for changes in the rhythm of the home. A creak meant checking the walls. A sudden silence meant tending the fire. Fear sharpened the senses, urging families to act before danger grew. The stories told by elders of lights seen on distant hills, or whispers carried by snowstorms, kept younger listeners alert. Whether these tales described real events or remnants of older experiences, they helped shape instincts that protected generations. Around the hearth, families shared these stories not only to pass time, but to give shape to the formless dread outside. Naming a fear gave it boundaries. Understanding it, even through myth, reduced its power. In this way, storytelling became a tool for survival, as vital as a sealed window or a well-fed fire. Each tale reinforced the idea that the night must be respected because it remembered things that people had forgotten. The emotional weight of winter was a danger in its own right, one that pressed inward even as the cold pressed from outside. But through shared stories, careful vigilance, and rituals practiced without question, families carried themselves through the long hours. And beyond these emotional trials lay the more tangible dangers, the predators, storms, and silent hazards that shaped the next chapter of winter's story. Winter brought many dangers, but not all of them crept in through cracks in the walls. Some moved on silent paws across the snow, leaving only faint impressions that vanished with the next gust of wind. Long after families retreated indoors and fires dimmed to embers, the land beyond the village stirred with life. Snow crunched softly in patterns too deliberate to be the wind. A low growl sometimes drifted along the frozen air, so distant it felt more imagined than heard. Yet in the morning, paw prints circled barns and paths, delicate as etchings on white parchment, reminding everyone that the night had visitors. Wolves roamed closest during harsh winters, their hunger sharpening their movements. They were not monsters, but animals pushed by cold and scarcity, moving with the intelligence of creatures shaped by long seasons of survival. Mountain cats followed the edges of forests, their steps so light that only the most attentive could detect their presence. Even bears, usually deep in winter sleep, wandered during difficult years when their fat stores failed them. Villagers learned to read the land for warnings: broken twigs, disturbed snow, the absence of familiar animal tracks. Shepherds often slept near the barns, lightly and with one ear open, sensing trouble before it grew bold. Children were taught early to read signs in the snow, not as a game but as a quiet form of self-preservation. Night watchers recognized predator calls, knowing how far away they were by the length of the echo and the way the wind carried it. The calls were not merely sounds, they were messages written into the night, signals passed between land, animal, and human. What remains curious is how similar these patterns appear in stories scattered across distant regions. Folklore from northern Europe mirrors tales found across mountain villages in Asia, reports of predators approaching on the same kinds of nights, under the same conditions, following rhythms that seem too consistent to be coincidence. It hints at a knowledge shared across cultures, perhaps learned from ancestors who once watched the same movements in older winters. These predators were not intruders but parts of the cold itself, reminders that winter was alive and observant. And while their presence posed danger, another threat lingered far closer, silent, unseen, and capable of slipping into any home no matter how carefully it was prepared. Winter was not just a battle against the cold that crept from the outside, but a careful negotiation of dangers that existed even within the warmth of home. Modern homes are sealed against the chill, but in the old days, the same ceiling that kept out the frost also trapped silent killers. The weight of snow on roofs, the dangerous fumes from poorly ventilated hearths, and invisible gases lurking in the air could all be as deadly as any predator stalking outside. Families learned to adjust vents, checking them carefully before nightfall, ensuring that the fire's breath would not smother them in their sleep. Elders woke often during the night, listening to the crackling of embers, their hands moving to shift the firewood, feeling for heat, checking for the creeping cold of smoke. They knew the danger of too much warmth, but also of too little ventilation. Too much air locked inside meant the fire would die, leaving the house cold and vulnerable to another freeze. Too little meant the build-up of dangerous fumes that slowly suffocated, unnoticed, until morning. Children were trained to recognize the faint dizziness that meant the air had thickened with something far more dangerous than smoke. Old folk warnings, passed down from one generation to the next, spoke of a sleeping fire. "The sleeping fire breathes," they would say, a phrase that may seem poetic or mysterious to modern ears. But it revealed a complex understanding of airflow, of the delicate balance required to keep warmth in and keep poisons out. What these warnings described wasn't superstition, but an ancient awareness of how heat and air moved through a home. In some villages, homes were built with secret vents tucked into rooftops or hidden within wall seams. These vents were passed down quietly, generation after generation, carefully adjusted each winter. They were never written down, yet they carried knowledge more practical than anything recorded in books. Few noticed these vents, or even spoke of them until they became a forgotten method of survival, their quiet function hidden under the layers of time. The ancient family's battle was as much about controlling the air as it was about controlling the warmth. Winter survival required a balance that was not only physical, but deeply intelligent, recognizing that what couldn't be seen might be the most dangerous of all. As the days grew shorter and the nights stretched longer, the darkness took on a weight of its own. In areas where winter seemed to never loosen its grip, people lived under a sky that often seemed to press down on them, thick and heavy, as if time itself had slowed. Days bled into nights, with only the dim glow of the hearth to distinguish one from the other. In these places, winter was not just a season, but a psychological force, shaping not only the environment, but the very minds of those who endured it. With so little sunlight to guide them, people's bodies were forced into rhythms that felt unnatural. Sleep cycles became fragmented, their bodies waking in the middle of the night when the darkness felt deepest, their minds wandering into spaces where shadows seemed to stretch endlessly. Fear crept in with the cold, made sharper by the sensation of being alone, even within the warmth of a home. People began to interpret the strange flickers of movement at the edge of their vision, the sounds of wind that seemed to murmur, as something more than natural. In the absence of light, the mind wove stories of spirits and wanderers lost to the cold, of ghosts who moved through the dark to claim the warmth of the living. Rather than dismissing these beliefs, it's important to understand them as early attempts to explain the emotional strain that accompanied this deep winter darkness. Families gathered around the hearth, telling stories not just for entertainment, but as a way to maintain their morale. Elders recited chants or whispered prayers to calm anxious minds, grounding their loved ones in a shared rhythm, a collective strength against the feeling of being adrift. Children learn not only how to handle physical cold, but how to manage the cold of the mind, recognizing when fear began to take root and telling themselves that it was merely the darkness playing tricks. What is fascinating about these rituals is how similar they are across cultures, despite the vast distances and differences between them. Similar practices can be found in distant corners of the earth, each one a coping mechanism designed to deal with the isolation and dread of winter's endless nights. It hints at shared psychological responses to the dark, responses that have echoed through human history long before written language could record them. In the depth of these cold nights, when the mind was left alone to wrestle with its fears, the community's strength depended not only on fire and food, but on the stories they told each other to remind themselves that they were not alone. As the earth tightened under the weight of winter's dark embrace, strange phenomena began to appear. In the stillness of frozen fields, faint glows flickered above the snow, like distant lanterns that had no source. These lights, sometimes described as blue or green, shimmered in the air, casting long, ghostly shadows across the land. Travelers who wandered late in the season swore they saw these lights dance in the distance, vanishing before they could approach. Even more curious were the eerie reflections on the ice light that seemed to bend and shift with no apparent cause. Were they the result of the moon's glow bouncing off frozen surfaces, or something else entirely? As these visual anomalies persisted, so did the strange sounds that accompanied winter's hold. Deep cracks echoed through the ice as sheets of it shifted imperceptibly, a sound that sometimes rose in sudden booms, like distant thunder beneath the earth. The rustle of wind through bare trees, a noise so faint it could be mistaken for whispers, became the source of countless local stories. In the stillness of a snowstorm, voices from far away seemed to carry over the frozen landscape, amplifying the smallest sounds until they became clear and distinct. Was it the wind playing tricks on the mind, or something more mysterious, a lost traveller, or the voice of a spirit carried on the cold breath of winter? These experiences were not unique to one culture or region. Similar accounts fill the pages of medieval chronicles, from European villages to the frozen wilderness of Siberian tribes. The consistency of the stories, the similarities in what people reported seeing and hearing, raise questions that science has never fully answered. How could so many from different times and places describe the same strange occurrences if they were nothing more than illusions of a cold mind? Perhaps it's not a coincidence that these phenomena seem to thrive in extreme cold. When temperatures plummet, certain atmospheric events become more pronounced distortions in light, sounds amplified by the stillness and the behavior of the air itself. In today's world, where most of us are shielded from such extremes, these occurrences have become nearly forgotten. What once felt like a regular part of life, now lost to the comforts of modern warmth, may have been more than just trickery of the senses. They may have been signs, natural but rare, glimpsed only by those who lived on the edge of winter's reach. In the deepest winters, survival was not only a matter of food, fire, or shelter. It was a test of the mind, a quiet endurance that required as much mental discipline as physical strength. People did not simply prepare their homes or gather food, they trained themselves to face the endless cold without breaking. Elders, with their deep understanding of the season, taught younger generations how to control not only their bodies but their thoughts. Around the fire, where the warmth of the hearth seemed a world away from the outside, elders guided their children in exercises that would strengthen their minds against the psychological weight of winter. They taught slow breathing, focusing on the rhythm of inhaling and exhaling, near windows that let in the cold air. With each breath, the cold seemed less oppressive, the mind sharper, more able to withstand the biting chill. When the wind howled outside, families practiced rhythmic counting, tapping their fingers on the edge of the table, syncing their thoughts with the steady, predictable sound of the crackling firewood. These rituals weren't called meditation, but they served the same purpose. They calmed the mind, brought focus, and stilled the racing heart. The cold might freeze the skin, but it could not freeze the mind. At night, before sleep claimed them, children were taught to listen to, truly listen to the world around them. Silent listening rituals sharpened their awareness, allowing them to hear not just the wind, but the subtle movements of the animals outside, the faint shifts in the house itself, and the quiet changes in the air. Adults, too, had their practices. They learned to conserve their emotional energy, drawing boundaries between real dangers and imagined fears. The darkness played tricks on the mind, causing shadows to stretch and grow, but adults understood the value of distinguishing between the tangible threats and the phantoms born of fear. As a family, they learned to prepare their minds as carefully as their food stores, thoughtfully, deliberately, with an understanding that mental resilience was as vital to survival as warmth. What is particularly striking is that similar rituals appear in disparate cultures, from mountain tribes in Asia to remote villages in northern Europe. The practices may differ slightly, but the essence is the same: an ancient psychology shaped by winter, a shared understanding that the cold could be survived not just by bodies, but by a focused, resilient mind. As winter's darkness stretched its long fingers into the hours, it became more than just a time of cold. It transformed into a canvas for rituals designed to restore balance. People, living within the grip of this relentless night, began to carve meaning into every action, weaving symbols and stories into their daily routines as a means of psychological survival. Lighting a candle at a specific hour wasn't just a simple gesture to illuminate a room. It was a signal, a reminder that light still held sway over the dark, even if for a brief moment. The flicker of that flame provided warmth, not only to the room but to the soul, a tiny victory in the face of an overwhelming season. In the quiet of the night, families traced shapes in the ash of the hearth, their fingers moving in deliberate patterns. Some believed that these marks could ward off ill fortune or keep spirits from entering. These weren't acts of superstition, but structured rituals meant to reinforce emotional stability. Each stroke in the ash was a gesture of control, a way to combat the uncontrollable cold pressing against their homes. Placing objects near windows, stones, herbs, or pieces of cloth became symbols of protection, as if the very act of arranging them in these sacred spaces could push back the dark that hovered just beyond the threshold. Though these rituals may seem quaint or even strange to modern minds, they served a profound purpose. They anchored people's emotions, creating a sense of order in an environment ruled by unpredictability. Rituals of the dark were never just about the actions themselves. They were about the internal peace these practices brought, the reminder that the world could still be shaped by intention, even when winter's darkness was at its deepest. Some of these rituals resemble practices from ancient pagan traditions, lighting candles, placing objects for protection, but their roots reach even further. When comparing them across cultures that never met, the similarities are striking. These traditions suggest that winter rituals might stem from a shared cultural memory, an ancient connection to the rhythms of darkness and light that predated written history. Perhaps, in the silence of long winter nights, our ancestors tapped into something older than themselves, a collective understanding that the cold could be survived only through the quiet power of ritual. As winter's darkness descended, the cold took more than just physical warmth. It threatened to freeze the spirit. To endure, entire villages developed shared methods to maintain emotional balance, strategies designed to ensure that fear would not spread like wildfire through their close-knit homes. Before the coldest months arrived, leaders gathered the community, distributing roles and setting the tone for the coming season. They resolved conflicts before they could fester, established routines for surviving the cold, and quietly reminded everyone that panic could be just as deadly as frostbite. In the heart of the winter storm, the people of these villages found strength in unity. Communal songs were sung during snowstorms, their melodies rising above the howling wind. These songs, familiar and calming, wrapped themselves around the village like a thick blanket, keeping spirits steady and hearts connected. Torchlit walks became a regular event, with groups of families moving through the drifting snow, a silent reassurance that no one would face the night alone. These walks were more than simple excursions. They were signals that even the fiercest snowstorms could not erase the bonds between people. As the long nights stretched on, villagers gathered in storytelling circles, their voices rising in gentle cadence. Elders shared tales of winters past, of harsh storms survived, and of spring's eventual return. These stories didn't just pass time, they occupied restless minds, quieting the fear that rose when the wind moaned through empty streets. The stories connected the present to the past, reminding everyone that the cold had always been a part of life, and that each winter was just another chapter in an ongoing cycle of survival. A role that emerged in multiple cultures, under various names, was that of the fear watcher, an individual assigned to stay awake during the harshest nights. Their job was simple, yet profound, to keep the atmosphere inside the home calm and steady. They listened to the wind and the snow, ensuring that the fear of the unknown didn't grow. Whether this role was formally recognized or not, it existed as an emotional anchor for families, a quiet reminder that even in the darkest moments, someone was awake, keeping watch. These practices suggest a long-forgotten strategy, passed down through generations. Emotional survival was as vital as physical survival. And while it may seem odd to plan for fear itself, the reality was clear: without maintaining calm, the cold would take more than just warmth. In the coldest months, when darkness seemed unwilling to release its hold on the land, hope became more than a feeling. It was a tool, quiet, subtle, and carefully tended like the fire itself. Families understood that without something to look toward, the weight of winter could settle too heavily on the heart. So they kept small reminders near their beds: a letter from a distant friend, a feather found during a warmer season, a carved figure shaped by a parent's hands. These were not decorations. They were anchors, each one whispering that spring would come again. Elders played an important role in nurturing this sense of hope. At night, when the wind pressed against the walls and the cold hummed through the wooden beams, they shared stories of winters far harsher than the present one. They spoke of storms that lasted for days, of snow piled higher than windows, of nights so dark the sky seemed to have forgotten the sun. Yet every tale ended the same way, with the world thawing, the rivers moving again, and life returning in soft, green waves. These stories were reminders that endurance was woven into the fabric of their people. Belief itself had a calming effect. The anticipation of warmer days eased tension in the body, softened the heartbeat, and steadied the breath. Even children who clung to their carved tokens during the coldest hours felt a sense of security that science might now call psychological resilience. Back then, it was simpler. The mind needed warmth just as much as the body did, and hope provided it. Families practiced rituals to cultivate this inner warmth. Some placed a bowl of grain near the hearth each night, symbolizing the first planting of spring. Others tied pieces of dyed cloth to beams above their beds as a promise to themselves that better days would return. These traditions were older than any organized belief, passed down quietly through centuries, as if humanity had always known that darkness could be crossed only when the spirit had something to hold on to. Hope may seem fragile, but in those long winters, it was one of the strongest tools people possessed. It kept thoughts steady, guided dreams away from fear, and reminded entire communities that even the most relentless cold could not last forever. And with that gentle assurance, they prepared to face whatever waited in the next chapter of winter's unfolding story. In the heart of winter, when daylight faded early and the world beyond the doorway turned silent and strange, people relied on tools created specifically for the darkness. These were not grand inventions or elaborate machines. They were small, precise objects shaped by centuries of trial and error, each one designed to solve a problem that only winter could create. A villager stepping into the cold night carried these tools, the way a sailor carries instruments at sea, trusting their quiet usefulness more than any spoken rule. One such tool was the frost knocker, a long-handled stick with a weighted end. It was used to test frozen surfaces and break thin sheets of ice that formed over paths and roofs. Its dull thud cut through the silence like a warning and a reassurance at once. Hanging from the villager's belt was an ember carrier, a small clay vessel wrapped in woven reeds. Inside it, a single glowing coal could survive for hours, allowing warmth to travel through the night without exposing flame to the wind. The faint smell of heated clay followed the villager wherever they walked, a scent tied closely to winter itself. For communication, Especially during storms when visibility vanished, villagers used hollowed animal horns. A single blast from one could travel far across snow-laden fields, carrying messages of danger, arrival, or need. Each family knew the calls by sound alone, the short alarm, the long greeting, the rhythmic pattern that meant someone was lost. And when roofs sagged under the weight of heavy snow, compact iron hooks allowed people to clear the build-up without stepping outside, pulling the drifts free from the safety of a window or loft. What makes these tools remarkable is how similar versions appear in distant cultures. Frost knockers, resembling wooden mallets, show up in northern Europe, while ember carriers, nearly identical in shape, appear in the mountains of East Asia. Communications horns echo traditions from Siberia to the far north of the Americas. These cultures had no known contact, no shared language, no common teachers, yet their winter tools match with uncanny precision. Such parallels raise a quiet question. Did humans simply arrive at the same solutions through the pressure of the same cold? Or did these tools descend from a much older source, some forgotten root of winter knowledge carried across continents before memory solidified into history? Either way, these small inventions reveal a deeper truth. Survival in the dark depended not only on warmth, but on the wisdom embedded in every tool the villagers held. Long before anyone spoke of insulation or thermal efficiency, families understood that the land itself held power. Winter forced them to look closely at the materials around them, noticing how stone, soil, and even the bodies of animals gathered and released heat. In a small winter home, the hearth glowed softly as large river stones were placed directly into the fire. Hours later, when they were too hot to touch, the stones were lifted with wooden tongs, wrapped in thick cloth, and buried beneath bedding. Through the night, they released warmth slowly, radiating comfort long after the flames in the hearth had quieted. Villagers also shaped the soil around their homes with unexpected precision. They carved shallow alcoves into earthen walls, turning them into natural heat pockets that warmed gently as fires burned nearby. These alcoves held warmth like memory, releasing it long after the last ember faded. Some homes were built partially below ground, not as a stylistic choice, but because the earth provided a steady temperature that resisted the freezing air outside. Sleeping in these spaces felt like resting inside the planet's own breath. Families who lived near barns discovered another source of warmth, one that breathed and shifted just as they did. By placing sleeping areas against walls shared with livestock, heat passed quietly from animal bodies through the timber, warming the rooms without a single flame. In the darkest months, this simple arrangement saved more lives than any grand invention. It blurred the line between human and animal spaces, revealing a subtle cooperation shaped by necessity. These methods required no metal pipes, no devices, no complexity, only patience and careful observation. People learned where the sun lingered in winter, arranging their homes to capture the last rays before they disappeared behind snow-covered hills. They studied how warmth moved through stone and soil, discovering properties we now describe with scientific language, but which they once understood instinctively. What deepens the mystery is how far back some of these techniques stretch. Archaeologists have uncovered fire-warmed stones in ancient sites thousands of years older than the villages that continued the practice. It suggests a lineage of knowledge passed quietly from generation to generation, carrying echoes of ancestors whose understanding of nature may have been far deeper than ours. Through these methods, warmth became a partnership with the land, a reminder that survival once depended not on machines, but on listening closely to the world beneath our feet. In the coldest months, warmth became a kind of currency precious, carefully saved, never spent without thought. Inside a winter home, every ember and every breath of heat had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. As night settled and temperatures dropped, families boiled water not simply for tea or cooking, but to create pockets of steam that rose toward the ceiling, warming the upper spaces before gradually settling back into the room. The soft hiss of the pot was part of their nightly rhythm, a sound that carried both comfort and quiet strategy. Pots of warm grain were placed near cold corners, absorbing chill that might sneak into the home. These grains would later be eaten, their warmth transferred once again into the body. Even the layout of belongings had intention. Polished metal pieces, mirrors, small plates, or even sharpened tools were positioned to reflect the fire's glow, stretching the light farther into shadowed rooms, making a single flame work harder than it seemed capable of. Families learned that reflection could do as much as fuel, creating the illusion of greater warmth and pushing back the darkness a little more. Under beds and beside walls, sealed containers held heated sand. This sand, warmed by the hearth, radiated heat for hours without smoke or flame. Children often curled their toes against the pots, feeling a gentle heat that lasted long after the fire dimmed. Even their movements were designed to conserve energy. People rose from their beds slowly, keeping blankets wrapped around them until they were inches from the hearth. Tasks were timed with the fire's strength. Meals were cooked during the coldest hours, when the extra heat from the pot helped lift the temperature of the room. These habits formed a cycle of warmth that moved throughout the home like a soft current. One action fed the next. Nothing burned without reason, and not a single spark was allowed to fade unnoticed. Families learned to gauge their resources with a precision that feels astonishing today. Their practices, simple as they may seem, often outperformed modern methods, revealing an old wisdom hidden beneath the routines of long-forgotten winters. When viewed closely, these efforts feel like fragments of a larger system, one in which heat was gathered, guided, and reused with remarkable efficiency. And as we turn from these humble tricks, the story leads us towards something even more intriguing. The subtle technologies that historians rarely mention, yet still linger in the ruins of ancient winter homes. As winter deepened, people turned to tools and techniques now mentioned only in passing, if at all. These were not the famous inventions of kings or scholars, but quiet technologies born from necessity and shaped by the land itself. One of the most intriguing was the clay radiator. Simple vessels moulded from dense earth, heated near the hearth until they glowed faintly. Long after the fire weakened, these clay forms stayed warm, releasing steady heat through the night. Families placed them beneath benches or beside beds, trusting their gentle warmth more than the fickle flames of a dwindling fire. Another forgotten method involved salt-brine mixtures stored in thick wooden tubs. When certain minerals were added, these mixtures produced a low, controlled heat that lasted for hours. This warmth was modest, almost modest to the point of invisibility, but in a freezing home its presence meant comfort. Villagers used these tubs sparingly, often during the harshest storms, allowing their strange chemical warmth to push back the cold that seeped under doors and through roof seams. Some structures were built with hollow wooden chambers hidden inside their walls. These chambers captured ember heat, channeling it through narrow passages that warmed rooms with surprising efficiency. Visitors often noted that certain homes felt warmer than their modest fires suggested, unaware that they were standing inside a subtle piece of winter engineering. These wooden chambers required craftsmanship and knowledge of airflow skills rarely written down, but passed quietly through generations. Then there were the winter drums. Round, taut frames stretched with hide, hung near entrances or in lofts. When struck, they produced deep vibrations that travelled through the structure of the house. Some believed the sound strengthened beams under heavy snow. Others used the drums as psychological tools, their rhythmic pulse calming frightened children during storms. Whether structural or symbolic, their exact purpose remains uncertain. What complicates the story is how familiar some of these technologies appear when compared to artifacts found across ancient settlements thousands of miles apart. Clay warming stones resemble pieces uncovered in prehistoric sites, far removed from medieval villages. Salt brine heating tubs echo practices recorded in both Arctic and desert cultures. And hollow chambers for heat distribution appear in ruins whose builders never knew one another. These parallels suggest something quietly astonishing, that winter knowledge may have resurfaced repeatedly across eras, as if humanity kept rediscovering the same ideas whenever the cold demanded more than fire alone. And with these forgotten tools, we step toward another winter mystery. How people once moved through frozen landscapes with skill and intention, guided by methods as subtle as they were powerful. In the deep quiet of winter, sound travelled differently. A single misplaced step could echo across a frozen field, revealing a traveller's presence long before they came into view. For this reason, moving through snow became an art form one taught not with words, but with example. A villager stepping into the open landscape adjusted their movements immediately, placing each foot with deliberate care. They shifted their weight slowly, letting the snow settle beneath them before committing to the next step, as if they were conversing with the ground rather than walking over it. Hunters mastered this technique early. They learned that pressing the outer edge of the foot down first softened the crunch, while rolling inward reduced the sound even further. Children practiced these movements in games, unaware they were rehearsing skills their ancestors had relied on for centuries. In the stillness of winter, silence was protection. Any careless noise could startle prey, alert a predator, or announce one's approach to unfriendly ears. To aid their travels, villagers crafted snowshoes woven from willow branches. These wide frames distributed weight across the snow, preventing the sinking steps that created deep, telltale prints. Cloth wraps were tied around boots to muffle the sound of packed ice rubbing against leather. Over generations, families created winter corridors, paths flattened by repeated movement, deliberately shaped long before the heavy snows arrived. These corridors allowed people to travel quickly and quietly, gliding across the landscape, while the untouched snow on either side remained a natural barrier. Stories from different regions speak of something even more unusual. Children taught to walk in synchronized patterns. Whole groups stepping in unison created overlapping prints so difficult to distinguish that predators or enemies could not track how many people had passed through. Sometimes the prints resembled those of a single large creature, a subtle trick meant to confuse anything following behind. Whether born from necessity or deeper tradition, this collective movement gave villages an advantage in landscapes where visibility was often reduced to a few steps ahead. Moving through winter was never just about reaching a destination. It was about reading the land, understanding the sound of one's own footsteps, and learning how to disappear into the silence when needed. And once a person mastered that silence, the next challenge awaited finding their way through a world where every landmark hid beneath the same white blanket, and the horizon offered no guidance at all. In a landscape where the world was blotted out by snow, navigation became a skill shaped by memory, instinct, and the quiet understanding of nature's subtle cues. When the sun disappeared behind grey clouds and the horizon melted into a blank sheet of white, travelers had no choice but to trust the land beneath their feet, the way the wind moved, and the stars overhead. Winter stripped away familiar markers, trees, hills, even the shape of the road. The few visible features, like snowdrifts and wind-carved ridges, became the true guides. Shepherds learned to feel their way through blizzards, not by sight, but by touch. Their hands moved over familiar fence posts, sensing the coldness of the wood, the way the wind had shifted around them. Every post told a story, a quiet landmark that reminded them of where they had been and where they needed to go. Their movements were measured, not by the need to hurry, but by an instinct that told them when to pause, when to listen, and when to step forward. For traders, traveling at night under a moonlit sky was often safer than trying to make their way through daylight storms. The snow, illuminated by the pale light, offered contrast where everything else had blurred into sameness. A footpath hidden by drifts might reveal itself under the moon, or the edge of a mountain ridge would appear clearer than it had during the day. What was once a vast white desert became a map, written in the soft glow of night. In these worlds, survival depended not only on being able to see, but on knowing how to read the landscape. Villagers knew which trees grew where, and how moss clung to the north-facing sides of trunks. The patterns of wind on snow, the way drifts formed, even the shadows cast by the faintest moon, all told travelers how to move forward. What makes this navigation fascinating is how it appears across unrelated cultures. Similar techniques are found in places that never had contact with one another. North European shepherds, using the wind, native Arctic peoples reading snow texture, and traders in far-off lands relying on the stars. These methods point to something universal in human survival, a shared knowledge born of the same winter challenges. As travelers moved through this whitened world, they did not simply navigate. They learned to trust the landscape itself, and in return, it whispered its secrets to them. In the world of endless snow and ice, danger often hid beneath the surface, silent and invisible to the untrained eye. Yet for those who understood the land, the signs were clear. Crossing a frozen creek or a snow-covered field was never simply a matter of putting one foot in front of the other. It was an exercise in constant vigilance, every step taken with care, every sound listened to, every shift in the landscape studied. Hunters, the first to master these skills, learned early how to sense the hidden dangers beneath their feet. The method was deceptively simple. Tap the ground with a stick, gently at first. If the ice or snow felt solid, the sound would resonate with a reassuring clarity. But if it was hollow or unstable, the sound would change softer, muffled, or even oddly distorted. For those who knew what to listen for, this subtle change could mean the difference between safety and disaster. Hunters carried this knowledge with them, passing it along to children during evening walks and whispering warnings around the fire. "Listen to the snow," they would say, as if the land itself spoke in a language only the attentive could hear. Beyond sound, there were other signs. The colour of the snow, the way it settled in drifts, the texture of the surface beneath the frozen crust. Snow that looked smooth and untouched could be hiding pockets of air, hollow spaces left by melting beneath the surface. A slight discoloration in the snow often revealed a dangerous crevice or a layer of ice too weak to trust. Even the shifting winds, which sometimes created small ridges or patterns in the snow, could indicate where the ground was unstable. These methods weren't just for hunters. Entire communities depended on them, from shepherds moving across snowy pastures to families travelling between villages. This knowledge wasn't written down, it was passed down through stories, quietly shared during the long winter nights. It was the kind of wisdom that could save lives, yet it was rarely spoken of directly. Instead, it was embedded in imagery, in seemingly whimsical stories about spirits or the voices of the snow. These so-called superstitions, often dismissed as fanciful beliefs, were actually subtle codes, instructions for reading the landscape, preserving ancient knowledge through memorable, symbolic images. As travellers navigated these treacherous lands, they were not simply moving through an empty white world. They were engaging in a delicate dance with nature, using all their senses to understand the world beneath the snow's surface, where danger hid in plain sight. In the most severe winters, survival was not only about enduring the cold at home. For some, it meant crossing frozen landscapes for weeks, carrying messages, goods, or medicines across distances no modern traveller would dare attempt. These were the journeys of messengers, traders, seasonal hunters, and healers, who ventured deep into the wilderness, relying not just on physical strength, but on mental endurance and strategy. One such journey began with the smallest of rituals, counting steps. A single footstep, followed by another, became the most basic form of movement, a rhythmic way to combat the crushing weight of isolation. To track their path, travellers would mark snowdrifts with branches or carve lines in the snow to make sure they wouldn't stray into dangerous terrain. They carried leather pouches filled with snow, which they would melt over small fire pits to drink. This was a slow process, but one that saved precious energy, as water was needed not just for hydration but for warmth. Time was measured not by clocks, but by breath. Every exhale became a gauge of endurance. Travellers would focus on the rhythm of their own breathing, counting their steps, breathing in sync with the pace they set. It was an internal system of survival, a method designed to maintain a steady, sustainable effort without burning through the body's reserves too quickly. When they stopped for the night, camps were constructed swiftly. Snow blocks were piled up to form protective walls, hides were spread beneath them, and small fire pits shielded from the wind by natural formations provided warmth. But the most compelling mystery was how some of these winter paths followed routes older than the villages they were travelling to. Through the centuries, generations of people had carved their way through the same land, leaving invisible trails etched into the landscape itself. These routes were not just created by the current generations of settlers, they were remnants of migration paths carved out long before recorded history, paths that connected distant people in ways we now struggle to understand. As travellers moved through the frozen wilderness, they unknowingly followed ancient roads, paths worn down by the footsteps of ancestors who also sought survival in a world defined by snow and silence. These long journeys, though undertaken for simple reasons, trade, travel, necessity, may have been linked to something far deeper, the echoes of human migration across vast and unforgiving landscapes. The decline of ancient winter skills wasn't sudden, but a gradual, almost unnoticed shift. For centuries, the survival of entire communities had depended on the shared knowledge of winter. People lived intimately with the cold, understanding how to trap warmth, navigate snow, and preserve both food and spirit through the darkest months. But as towns grew larger and trade routes expanded, this relationship with winter began to fade. With the rise of urban centres, the very nature of life began to change. Rural families who once relied on deep ancestral knowledge started migrating to bustling marketplaces. There, they traded their handmade goods for imported fabrics, spices, and foods. What had once been carefully cultivated knowledge how to heat a home with stone, how to preserve the warmth of the hearth, how to make the most of limited daylight was gradually replaced by things that were easier to acquire and use. Early stoves, for example, offered a cleaner, faster solution to heating a home, eliminating the need for carefully managed fires and the knowledge of how to maximize their heat. Processed foods from far-off places filled the shelves of new shops, making the long hours of careful food preparation seem unnecessary. Families who once had intricate traditions passed down over generations, each skill honed through seasons of trial and error, found themselves increasingly reliant on merchants and manufactured goods. The self-sufficiency that once allowed people to survive the harshest winters was quietly replaced by convenience. Instead of relying on natural materials, people began to lean on goods imported from far away, materials that required little thought beyond purchasing. But this shift wasn't merely accidental. As emerging institutions, from governments to trade monopolies, solidified their control over regions, populations that could rely on themselves posed a challenge. The ability to survive winter through personal skill and collective knowledge was a form of autonomy. By replacing this skill with dependence on external systems, food stores, heating technology, and imported goods control was consolidated. Self-sufficient communities became harder to maintain as the focus moved from survival to convenience. In this shift from necessity to convenience, ancient wisdom didn't simply fade, it was, in a sense, deliberately erased. As people began to rely more on merchants and less on their own hands, the knowledge of winter survival quietly slipped away, buried under the comforts of progress. As the centuries passed, the way we remembered winter changed not naturally, but through deliberate curation. It wasn't just the passage of time that obscured ancient knowledge of winter survival. Institutions, from the churches to the growing power of kingdoms and later governments, shaped which practices were deemed worthy of record. In archives and ancient manuscripts, only certain winter techniques were praised as civilized. These were the methods embraced by the wealthy, the clergy, or those with formal power, while the more effective local practices, those used by farmers, hunters, and village healers, were often dismissed as superstitions. Chroniclers, with their pen in hand, prioritized the achievements of nobles and clergy. The delicate intricacies of rural winter survival, such as the careful use of heat-retaining stones, the communal strategies for surviving bitter cold, or the ingenious food preservation methods, rarely found their way into the official histories. What was recorded focused on the grand narratives that served the interests of the ruling class, kings, queens, and priests, who defined what was worthy of being remembered. The omission of these local traditions wasn't due to lack of value. In fact, many of these techniques were far more effective than the so-called civilized methods promoted by the institutions. They were simply ignored because they didn't align with the narrative that those in power wanted to preserve. Rural knowledge was seen as primitive, rooted in superstition or outdated practices, while the civilized approaches, often less practical but more aligned with the institution's goals, were elevated as models to follow. A curious inconsistency arises when we examine regional oral traditions. Stories passed down in rural villages and isolated communities often describe methods of survival that contradict the historical record. Techniques and rituals for enduring the winter were passed from generation to generation, many of which were never documented in official histories. The gap between the written word and the stories told by the people hints at a larger truth. What we know as history is often a narrow slice, shaped by those who had the power to decide which knowledge was worth preserving. In this deliberate omission, entire chapters of winter history were erased, not because they lacked value, but because they didn't fit into the larger narrative that institutions sought to impose. And in the absence of written record, much of the ancient wisdom was lost, disappearing quietly, as though it never existed at all. The arrival of the industrial age changed winter more profoundly than any shift before it. Cities began to glow with gas lamps, casting warm halos across snow-covered streets. Trains roared through frozen valleys, their metal wheels slicing across lands where once only silence ruled. Coal fires burned steadily inside crowded homes and apartments, offering heat without the slow rituals that had guided families through winter for centuries. For the first time, warmth was no longer something earned through preparation, it was purchased, delivered, and controlled by machines. As technology spread, survival slowly transformed from a communal craft into an individual convenience. People no longer needed to gather around shared fires or trade preserved foods between homes. The rhythms that once shaped winter, listening for the settling of walls, tending embers through the night, watching the snow for signs of danger, began to fade. Factories demanded predictable schedules, pulling workers away from the natural patterns of the season. The dawn could be ignored, and so could the early descent of night. Winter ceased to be a presence one negotiated with. It became an inconvenience that industry sought to overpower. During this shift, old traditions were treated with a kind of amused dismissal. Practices that had once protected families like heating stones in the hearth, layering homes with natural insulation, or following the moon's cycles to time winter feasts were suddenly labelled primitive. Generations abandoned these customs not because they were ineffective, but because they were told such knowledge belonged to a less civilized age. The subtle wisdom encoded within them, psychological steadiness, communal care, resourcefulness, vanished quietly as people turned toward technologies that required none of it. Industrial progress brought comfort, but it also created distance. The connection between people and their environments weakened, and with it, the intuitive skills that had once allowed communities to read the snow, the sky, and the shifting cold. Winter grew softer inside cities, yet colder in memory, becoming something abstract rather than lived. And as homes grew warmer, the collective memory of how to endure true winter began to slip away, replaced by the hum of machines and the assumption that the natural world no longer needed to be understood. This break marked the final turning point. Once technology reshaped winter, ancient skills faded, setting the stage for the next chapter, where the winter itself began to disappear before people could even realize what was being lost. As the world warmed, the long, brutal winters that had once shaped human survival slowly softened. Gradually, the frost seasons shortened. The cold that had once felt permanent began to retreat, and the deadly nights that had tested every aspect of life became far more manageable. In many regions, the ferocious winters that had demanded constant vigilance softened into a manageable chill, and the harsh winters of the past became only a memory. As the climate changed, so did the practices that had once been crucial for survival. The need for stone-heated beds, for wind mapping, for knowing how to track snow became less urgent. Families who had once spent hours preparing their homes for the worst no longer needed to stockpile firewood or monitor their hearths with such care. Snow tracking, once a vital skill for navigating frozen fields, was no longer necessary. The timing of winter rituals, designed to keep spirits calm during long, cold nights, gradually faded away. As generations passed, these practices were no longer part of daily life. The tools, the rituals, and the wisdom built from thousands of years of living with winter slowly vanished. In the span of a single generation, what had once been an intricate, necessary way of life was reduced to faint echoes preserved in stories, songs, and superstitions, but no longer part of the active knowledge passed down from parent to child. As winter softened, the urgency of survival faded, and so did the need for the wisdom that had kept people alive. Yet, there's an unsettling thought that lingers in this quiet shift. If the climate were to return to its former severity, how would modern society fare? What would happen if the winters grew as harsh as they once were, if the deadly cold returned in full force? With most of the ancestral knowledge forgotten, society might find itself dangerously unprepared, relying on technology and convenience without the practical wisdom of the past. In the forgotten knowledge lies a warning that climate cycles, while shifting, are never fully predictable. And if we ever return to the severe winters of old, we might have forgotten how to survive them. In the midst of the modern world, where the conveniences of technology shape nearly every aspect of our lives, a growing movement has begun to quietly emerge. It's a movement that seeks to recover something long forgotten, the skills, the wisdom, and the survival techniques once passed down through generations, but slowly erased by progress. Across the globe, people are turning their attention back to ancient ways of enduring the cold, drawn by the realization that there is something valuable in the knowledge once carried through winter's most brutal months. In remote workshops, artisans and survivalists are once again building clay stoves by hand, learning the old methods of harnessing heat from simple, natural materials. Wool wraps soaked in lanolin are being crafted, following age-old techniques used by shepherds and families who once braved the worst winters. Some groups even gather to practice silent walking through snow, retracing the steps of hunters and travelers who knew how to cross frozen terrain without leaving a trace. These practices, once thought to be primitive, are being revived with a new respect, an understanding that there is an elegance in their simplicity. Families are experimenting with stone heating, using ancient designs to warm their homes in ways that modern heating systems simply cannot replicate. Communities are rebuilding winter shelters, modeled after those used by their ancestors' structures, designed not only to survive the cold, but to embrace it, allowing warmth to be stored and distributed naturally. There's a quiet reverence in these efforts, as people rediscover their connection to the land and the resources that once ensured their survival. What's fascinating is that many of these rediscovered methods, when tested in extreme environments, outperform modern solutions. The clay stoves, though simple, radiate warmth more efficiently than many modern systems, and the wool wraps, soaked in natural oils, offer insulation that outpaces even the most advanced synthetic fabrics. The stone heating techniques provide a steady warmth that's nearly impossible to replicate with electric or gas-powered systems. These ancient practices are not just nostalgic echoes, they are practical tools that hold value even today. The revival of these methods isn't just about survival in a physical sense, it's a reawakening of human intuition, a return to a more instinctual understanding of how to live with the seasons rather than against them. As people retrace the steps of their ancestors, they are not simply learning old skills, they are reconnecting with a deeper, almost forgotten part of themselves. In recent years, something unexpected has begun to stir in the quiet corners of winter. Old rituals once dismissed as relics of a distant age have started to reappear, carried not by scholars or archivists, but by ordinary people searching for meaning during the long, dark months. In homes lit by soft lamps, candle rings are appearing on dinner tables, their glow symbolizing hope in the heart of winter. Families gather in circles to share stories, not because they have no other form of entertainment, but because something within them longs for the warmth of shared voices in the dark. Even in bustling cities, where winter is softened by heating systems and neon lights, people are returning to night walks. Wrapped in scarves and heavy coats, they wander through quiet streets or snowy parks, feeling the pull of a ritual they cannot name. These walks echo the communal night patrols of old villages, movements designed to reassure, to observe, to stay connected. The people who walk these paths today rarely know this history, yet something deep within them responds to the rhythm of moving together through the cold. Storytelling circles have also returned, often disguised as simple gatherings of friends. But when the lights dim, when the winter evening settles, and when people begin to speak softly about memories, fears, or hopes for the coming year, they are unknowingly mirroring the traditions of ancestors who gathered around firelight to steady their minds against the dark. These revived moments of connection feel natural, familiar in ways that surprise those who experience them. What makes this revival especially intriguing is how often it unfolds without conscious knowledge of its origins. People light candles because it feels right, or gather for warmth during storms without really knowing why. Families invent small winter traditions, placing objects on windowsills, sharing a single bright drink on solstice nights, or telling comforting winter tales, only to discover later that similar rituals existed hundreds or even thousands of years ago. It suggests a quiet truth, that winter rituals never fully disappeared. They sank into cultural memory, waiting for the moment when modern life grew quiet enough for people to hear their faint call again. These returning rituals mark the beginning of a deeper revival. As people rediscover symbolic practices, they naturally turn toward the practical ones as well, seeking ways to blend ancient intuition with modern innovation, forging new approaches to winter survival, shaped by both past and present. As the modern world rediscovers its forgotten winter wisdom, a new kind of traveler has emerged, one who carries both ancient intuition and advanced technology into the frozen wild. These explorers, researchers, and winter enthusiasts are learning that neither past nor present alone is enough. True survival comes from the quiet merging of both worlds. Imagine a winter expedition moving through a landscape of shimmering white. The team carries GPS devices, digital compasses, and thermal imaging cameras, yet their movements echo the practices of earlier centuries. Before choosing a direction, they pause to read the wind, observing the way it shapes the snow into subtle ridges. They note the tone of the ice beneath their steps, listening for the hollow sound that signals danger. Their insulated boots, products of modern engineering, are wrapped in wool bands soaked in natural oils, preserving warmth in a way that synthetic materials alone cannot achieve. Shelters built during these expeditions are modern in appearance, yet ancient in design. Panels are arranged to trap heat the same way stone homes once did. Entrances face away from prevailing winds, a practice common to both medieval villages and Arctic nomads. Inside, heated stones are placed beneath sleeping platforms to regulate warmth through the night, a technique thousands of years old, now revived because modern heaters often fail in extreme cold. This blending isn't sentimental longing for the past, it's strategy. When temperatures drop to levels that challenge human endurance, modern tools reveal their limits. Batteries freeze, metal stiffens, screens grow sluggish. In these conditions, ancient methods rooted in observation and simplicity become indispensable. There are recorded cases of expeditions where high-tech tents collapsed under wind pressure, yet shelters built with ancient airflow principles held steady. Times when water purifiers froze solid, but snow melted in leather pouches saved lives. Far from outdated, ancestral techniques amplify modern capabilities. They provide intuition where data falters, resilience where machinery weakens. The old ways taught people to read the land with their senses, not just with devices. Modern explorers who embrace both find themselves stronger, more aware, and more connected to the world around them. This fusion signals something important. The wisdom of the past is not lost. It is simply waiting for a time when humanity is willing to listen again. And as this rediscovery deepens, we move toward the final understanding of winter's true lessons. In every age, winter has been more than a season. It has been a quiet teacher, shaping the way people understood themselves and the world around them. Long before written history, long before cities or machines, winter demanded qualities that defined what it meant to be human. Cooperation was not a choice, it was a necessity. Families and communities relied on one another to survive the long nights, to share warmth, to protect the vulnerable, and to steady each other when fear crept close. In this way, winter forged bonds as strong as any metal pulled from the earth. Winter also taught patience, a skill often forgotten in the rush of modern life. The cold slowed everything: movement, speech, the passage of time. It asked people to wait, to endure, to quiet their minds, and listen to the world in ways they rarely did during the warmer months. Creativity, too, flourished in these dark seasons. Faced with relentless cold, people invented tools, rituals, and entire systems of living that revealed a deep, instinctual intelligence. Each method, whether heating stones, building shelters, or crafting winter garments, was not merely a technique, but an expression of human imagination shaped by necessity. Yet there was something deeper. Winter reminded people that they were part of nature, not separate from it. The snow, the wind, the darkness, these forces shaped their behavior, their calendars, their stories, their fears. Winter required humility, a recognition that survival came from respect for the land rather than conquest of it. In embracing these lessons, people came to understand themselves more clearly. They learned what they valued, what they feared, and what they hoped for when the world grew silent. Today, as lost winter knowledge slowly resurfaces, something subtle is happening. People are not just rediscovering old tools or forgotten rituals, they are reconnecting with truths carried quietly through human history. Truths about unity, about resilience, about the strength found in simplicity and the wisdom found in observation. Rediscovering winter wisdom is, in many ways, an act of remembering who we are beneath the layers of modern noise. Perhaps these lessons, shaped in the cold and tested by time, can guide us through the challenges ahead. Challenges that may have nothing to do with snow, yet everything to do with endurance, connection, and trust in ourselves. Winter, in the end, teaches us that survival is not just a physical act, it is a human one.